Happy Monday, everyone. John Lorden here with a bit of a different video for today. No, we're not doing a case cracked. We're talking a little bit more about making a murderer. If you caught the end of Brain Scratch last week, I teased that there was a special event related to making a murderer that happened in Minneapolis last week. I am back from that event literally as of minutes ago. I want to share some of the highlights of that event, tell you guys what it's about, and maybe get some insight into Brendan Dassey. Is it really over for him? Are there some new steps that can happen? Well, who could tell us about that? Who better than his attorneys? So that is what the event was. Here's an article over at citypages.com. Making a Murderer lawyers visit the Varsity, that's a theater close to the University of Minnesota, to talk true crime and false confessions. In late December of 2015, the world was captivated by Making a Murderer on Netflix. This Thursday, Dassey's lawyers, Steve Drizin, and Minnesota native Laura Nyrider will be hosting False Confessions, a conversation centering on their work and wrongfully convicted individuals. So that's where I wound up going. It turned out to be a 90-minute talk with them. The format was very similar to the meeting that I went to based on The Staircase with the attorney from The Staircase. I think it was about a month ago that I did that. There is essentially someone that has a list of questions that have been submitted from the audience. It's usually a local area DJ. They do an okay job asking other people's questions. It's just I feel like with someone that was a little more familiar with the material, they might get a little bit of a better interview, but it really does keep the focus on the guests that are there. So I have mixed feelings about it. But they started with a video that basically talked about false confessions, how they happen, and it's really troubling to watch that video. It's just at an emotional level, there's something about it that really kind of sank in with me. And one of the main points it talked about was the fact that you have police having the ability to lie to these people about evidence, about polygraph results, about what is going to happen to the person. You know, things like, oh, the district attorney wants to send you to jail for the rest of your life, or worse. And those things aren't true at all. And the pressures of having these lies can lead people, youth in particular, to say things that they don't really mean. And that's where we start getting into these false confessions. So I thought the video was a really good way to start the whole experience, to get us all kind of on the same track mentally. They spent a lot of time, of course, talking about Making a Murderer, and they talked about another case, which I didn't even know that they worked on, the West Memphis 3. Yeah, the same two people worked on that case as well. So another interesting tidbit that came out of that was they stated that in false confessions that they know are false, known false confessions, 95% of them wind up reciting info, actually confessing with information that is not public knowledge. And of course, that leads to the conversation about how people are being led in terms of the questioning, how the investigators could be dropping hints about what they want the people to say. It was just really interesting to me. 95% have info that's not public. And that's part of the challenge in terms of identifying these false confessions is they're talking about real facts that haven't been publicized. So when experts are looking at that, they're like, well, this confession must hold up. It's a piece that I've always kind of talked about on the channel in terms of a confession should not stand on its own. If I go to a police station and I literally say the words, I did this crime, that shouldn't be enough. There needs to be information that I'm giving them to let them know that I actually did do that crime. And what I learned in today's meeting, which I really didn't understand before, was they do essentially have that covered because 95% of these confessions, these false confessions, have information the public did not know about. However, if these confessions are recorded, then they're able to watch those recordings and say, hey, look, we've got the investigators basically feeding that person the information. Recording these confessions, the interrogations, and what they call, it's interesting because sometimes call them interviews. Other times they call them interrogations. But essentially, about 20 states currently require recordings of interrogations specifically. So there's a lot of states here in the U.S. that still don't have a requirement for that to happen, which is a little unfortunate. Also, of proven confessions, 30 to 40% of those proven false confessions specifically wind up being juveniles. So there does seem to be a bit of a larger number where this is happening to juveniles. And, I was kind of thinking about this as they were talking about different cases where this happens. And I don't think it's too hard for many of us to understand that when you were younger, some of us might have gotten into the pattern of being able to appease adults by telling them what we thought they wanted to hear. And in these cases, they're being told, hey, we're going to let you go home tonight if you say this. Or, hey, all this trouble that we're threatening you with, all that's going to go away if you just help us. So it was really interesting to me to hear that they have such a number when we're talking about 30 to 40% of proven false confessions are actually juveniles. There was a few moments where the mood lightened up a little bit. And it was interesting because it was specifically when they were talking about Brendan Dassey and the fact that they had whatever DNA evidence they had. You guys I assume you've watched Making a Murderer, so you know there's not much in terms of Teresa's DNA, but there's a few pieces that are found there. But what they were really highlighting was there was no DNA traces of Brendan at any of what they consider the major crime scenes. The bedroom, where supposedly all these terrible things happened to this woman, no traces of Brendan being in there at all, which is kind of interesting to me because I think about the fact, well, Brendan probably hung out at the house a little bit, so they should have found some traces of him somewhere, maybe not in particular in the bedroom, but to their point, no trace of him found in the bedroom, no trace of him found in the garage where the bullet fragment was found, and it's assumed that she could have been shot in that area, and no trace of him found in the car. So it was really interesting, but then there was this light moment that kind of came in where they were talking about Brendan, and obviously this is someone they know at a bit of a more personal level than us, and they basically said, look, Brendan's kind of clumsy. He's a bit of an oaf. And the whole place just kind of started laughing. And they were like, hey, look, no, we love him, but it's just true. He's just this kind of clumsy guy. So to think about putting him in these situations where he's supposedly doing these horrible things to this woman and he's not leaving any trace of the fact that he was there doing that just doesn't seem to hold up. I thought that was a really interesting point. They also talked about the fact that Making a Murderer seemed to get made primarily because of the success of the Serial podcast, which I didn't realize that there was such a correlation in there. But they talked about when they first started showing up to court years and years ago, there was these two women that were in the courtroom filming everything, and they said they were making a movie. At that point, they're basically collecting all the footage, but they hadn't sold the movie to anyone yet. So the lawyers kind of didn't take it seriously, and they're like, well, oh yeah, good luck with that. They obviously did not know of the mega success that Making a Murderer was going to become. Coming off the heels of that conversation, Laura made a very funny comment about the fact that she wished that she had brushed her hair for some of the scenes that actually wound up in there. And then, of course, what was equally as funny is Steve also made some comments that he wished that he brushed his hair as well, which obviously, if you can look at this picture, you see it wouldn't take him long to brush his hair. He also mentioned that when Making a Murderer released on Netflix, he was actually at a conference and he wound up bailing on the conference, staying in his hotel room, and he basically binge watched the entire thing. And he knew from that viewing that this was something really special and something that was going to catch on. But they still seem amazed by it all. They still seem really amazed that it's an international thing. As a matter of fact, for this tour that they're on, they do have some dates popping up in the UK as well. So for you UK brain scratchers out there, you might want to keep an eye out and see if you can get in on one of these meetings like I did out here. Another thing that came up, someone asked, is it common for these cases, especially trying to get someone that is thought to be innocent off, is it common for these cases to go on for a decade or more? And they said, yes, it is very, very common, especially if they don't have any type of DNA to kind of prove that that person is actually innocent of that. So there was some applause in the crowd when they made a few announcements, particularly about the governor of Wisconsin and that state attorney general who I kind of consider, if there's a villain, let's say, in the second season of Making a Murderer, I think most people would consider him to be that person. They announced that both of them did not get reelected earlier this month. Or last month, I guess, by the time you guys are seeing this. And the whole audience basically broke into applause on that. Now, how does that affect particularly what Brendan's going through? The former governor never provided clemency or any type of pardons for anyone. It's something that he just did not believe in. So what they're hoping for, and this could be a light at the end of the tunnel, in particular for Brendan, is that clemency or a pardon may now be possible with a new governor stepping into that position. Hopefully this is a person that will come in with their own set of ideals and not necessarily keep that process from the previous governor going forward of just not enacting any of those types of rules. So they said they're going to basically wait for the new governor to settle in, wait for his staff to all settle in, and then they're going to file some type of appeal with him to have this case reviewed and see if clemency or a pardon would be appropriate in this case. So that's one potential thing that could get Brendan out of this. Outside of that, they also mentioned the possibility. Laura basically said, you're never at a point where you're completely out of options. All that happens is it gets harder and harder to get courts to listen to you. And she spoke a little bit about the fact that courts like to have all the information up front. And every time you come back later, they say, well, why didn't you tell us that before? Where was that information before? So it's kind of interesting to hear them say that, because the feeling I got, particularly at the end of season 2 of Making a Murderer, was Brendan's kind of screwed and there's nowhere for them to go now. And she made it very clear that that's just not the case. There's always some type of option that you can take a shot with. Some people were wondering, how do they get paid? Obviously, the Dassey family or the Avery family is not funding what's going on in terms of the legal expenses for Brendan's case. They mentioned that the state of Wisconsin actually pays attorneys that are handling that post-conviction part of the process approximately $40 an hour. And they made an agreement with the state of Wisconsin. They said, look, keep your hourly rate, but just pay us for our travel expenses and any expert expenses that we incur. On top of that, they do take donations. Looks like they've got private funding, and they work with a college. So a lot of the work that they're doing, a lot of the research that they're doing, they basically have free researchers because they're leaning on their students. They're bringing their students into the fold of these cases and having them help with it. So it was really interesting to hear them talk about that aspect of it as well. So the whole thing ended on a little bit of another funny note. Someone asked, is there anything that wasn't shown in the documentary that the prosecution has in terms of information or evidence that would at least lead the prosecution to think that Brendan is truly guilty of this? And Steve answered that. Well, Steve started the answer by saying, no, there's nothing that they have that should lead them to believe that he's actually guilty. And I've read Ken Kratz's book. So the whole place, of course, started laughing at that. Laura responded to that saying, at least somebody did. And then he replied to that, yeah, I read it, but I didn't buy it. So that is how the evening ended. And I thought it was great. It was a little bit shorter than when I went to the one for the staircase. That one ran over 2 hours. This was more of a 90-minute thing. It started late, but it was really concise. It moved very well. And it was great, of course, to see these people in person, to hear more about their challenges, their struggles, their point of view on all this stuff. If you are interested in trying to help them in any way, they did give us a link. It is cwcy.org. law.org, and it actually forwards to another website. If we go here, it is www.law.northwestern.edu. And we can see a couple of familiar faces right there. If you're compelled to do so, you can donate from here. There's other information here about what you can do if you want to help, in particular with false confessions. I believe they have some templates for if you want to write your local officials to try to move them to adopt laws to help with this. Obviously, we've got 30 states out there still that don't even make it mandatory to video record these interrogations. And there's different aspects. There's certain laws that can be pushed to do that specifically for juveniles. But it kind of sounds like a good idea to me that they do it in general. And they also mention the fact that it's even being considered that they start recording all witness statements, which nowadays, especially with how cheap memory is and cameras are everywhere, I don't know why we aren't doing that already. So made a lot of sense to me. I thought it was great. If you're really into Making a Murderer, or if you're specifically into learning more about false confessions, I highly recommend that you try to catch one of these events if it comes close to you. Outside of that, if you can't get to one of these events, use the links in the description box below. Come check out Northwestern's site about this. Maybe you want to donate. Maybe there's other actions that you want to take. This is a good resource where you can learn more about all that stuff and see if you're moved to do something about it. Thank you so much for joining me on today's video. I'll see you back here on Wednesday with a brand new Brain Scratch Searchlight.